that moment when you're on stage, when you just feel, and you learn, it takes years to learn it, that this is the moment. And you just get off stage then, and the audience, and they get excited.
Yeah.
And another 5 minutes can bring them to a completely different place.
Today we're going to talk about when you should give up on a dream. Now you might be saying, Damon, no, my dream is my dream. That's why it's my dream. I'm going to keep going until I fulfill it. As someone who's actually fulfilled, particularly career-wise, sometimes you get to the end of a dream and you realize it's not really your fit anymore. The first instance of this is when it is destroying you or the people around you. If you're ambitious like myself, you go to no ends to get to where you need to be. I can share some stories where I hustled like crazy. Sometimes we can be so myopic, so focused on the particular dream, that particular goal, that we don't realize what's happening. What are your boundaries? What are you willing to give up? What are you, more importantly, not willing to give up? If you say that you're hustling for your family because you want your family to live well and for you to connect with your family, but then you're doing 20-hour days and you're feeling disconnected from your family and your family might literally leave because of that, then why are you really pursuing the dream? Because the people that you say you're doing it for are actually getting the short end of the stick. Giving up might be scaling it back. It might be finding another dream. It might be retrofitting, as they say, what that big idea is into something that fits your life even more. The second time to give up on a dream, this sounds funny, when you fulfill the mission. When we had started Cuddler, that connected people for hugs. So it was an app similar to Tinder or Grindr, but it was strictly platonic. And we ended up selling it about a year after we started. For myself, as one of the co-founders, my main intention was to move the cultural needle. There was a space of hookup apps, so people were just strictly trying to hook up. Then there was this epidemic. Scientists called it an epidemic as far as loneliness. Part of the cure from that is physical touch, including having hugs. It made perfect sense for us to do it at the time. We had 250,000 users. We're on the cover of the Wall Street Journal. We're the #1 app in the world twice within the year that we own the app. And at a certain point, me and my co-founders looked at each other and were like, oh, our work is done. We already changed the culture. We already hit that mark. So not only is it a matter of having a beautiful dream, it's also important to know when you actually reach that goal. Otherwise, you're going to be unfulfilled. Number 3, when you outgrow the dream or when the dream outgrows you. The dream outgrowing you can be tough because sometimes that means someone else beat you to the punch. Our dream was to accomplish that, was to make that impact on culture. But somebody else did it. You might need to let that go. But more crucially is the opposite of it, where you realize that you've outgrown the dream. That dream that you had 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So sometimes we end up growing, evolving beyond the scope of that dream that kept us warm for so many years. So I gave up on that dream of being a 6-figure writer. What's funny about that is as soon as I gave that up, I started to notice all these other ways that I could be creative and make a good living, including being a TED speaker, being a business coach, connecting with y'all through the Bring Your Worth show right now. As soon as I let go of that dream, then all these passive income streams and all these diverse things, including doing my startup Cuddler, started coming through the door. And I ended up getting closer to that 6-figure goal that way.
Dream big, but they don't tell you you're the one that's going to be pulling it up the hill.
Today we're going to talk about why we often miss our goals. I'm really into goal setting. I do that a lot with my one-on-one coaching, again with solopreneurs and side hustlers and a lot of folks like yourself. And the biggest challenge that we have isn't having unrealistic goals, but actually figuring out how to set the goals and reach them. We can do a lot of amazing stuff, but we got to have the right goals and most importantly, the right milestones, kind of like those check marks that you see when you drive on the highway to make sure that you're going in the right direction. That's the key here. The inspiration for this conversation comes from Andy Grove. He's the, I believe, late founder of Intel. He was a leader in the beginning, the first wave of Silicon Valley. Well before I got there, I'm thinking the 50s and the 60s, as a legendary guy. He did a lot of books on management and leadership after he started to get out of the spotlight, later on in the 70s and the 80s. And I actually learned about his stuff from Dan Heath, who has an excellent book called Upstream, which I'm reading right now. I highly recommend it. It's about taking care of things or issues before they actually arise. Again, looking at things upstream as opposed to trying to correct them downstream. And what he said from Andy, if I can call him Andy, what he said from Andy was that we often end up screwing up our goals because we'll have quantitative measures, again, measures based on numbers, and won't pair them with qualitative goals, as in things that are a little bit more nuanced, that are a little bit more abstract, but can be still put down into a goal or a piece of paper or a particular type of action or result. For instance, if you're going from point A to point B and you're a bus driver, or you're a pilot, and your main metric for knowing that you're doing your job well is to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible, there's a lot of things that can happen. You could be, if you're flying a plane as a pilot, then you could be flying from here in Las Vegas over to Phoenix, and you might be able to get that done in, say, a half an hour, maybe even 15 minutes. But you got passengers that are hurting, you got bumpy turbulence, you might not look at the weather report because you don't care because you're going to get there as quickly as possible. We can apply this to so many different things, right? We're looking at trying to get from point A to point B. That's the main metric. The same way that as Dan Heath mentions in the book Upstream, and as he talks about in regards to Andy Grove's wisdom here, that's why people cheat on tests. Because it's like the main goal is to get an A. They didn't talk about all these other details. It's like, get an A. That's it. There's none of that qualitative, again, qualitative measurement that's happening. It's just quantitative, but you need to have both. So if you're taking this proverbial flight from Las Vegas over to Phoenix, then it's not just a matter of saying, get there as quickly as possible. The qualitative could be saying, well, we're going to do a customer survey as soon as you land to find out what their experience was. And if those customers had a bad experience or they have issues, then you're going to be talked about in that regard. That's going to be reflective of your experience. So it's not a matter of just saying, I'm going to get there in 15 minutes, 20 minutes, get there as fast as possible. Boom, let's get the next set of passengers. It's also a matter of saying, what was the experience of the passenger? With the people I coach, there's so many challenges that people find because they're trying to get the next gig, get the next product sold. As I talked about in previous videos, that's the difference between a transactional relationship, which is you give me money, I give you the product, thank you, go about your way. There's no customer service. We already did the transaction, and I'll talk to you the next time I do another book, versus a relational relationship, if you can understand that. So a relational relationship is saying, I'm going to build a relationship with you even when I don't have anything to sell. I'm going to build a relationship with you even when you don't have any money or any other type of exchange for me right now. So that when I actually do have something to offer, you'll understand the value of our partnership, of our relationship. And I'm actually going to value you beyond just the price tag or other services or products that you're going to give towards me in return for the stuff I'm giving you. In other words, it's not just an exchange. It's actually a relationship being built. So that's what he means while you have the quantitative, I'm going to make X amount of money this year, and the qualitative, working with customers in a way where they'll want to come back later. In fact, this gets into the Simon Sinek idea of the infinite game. You're not just doing the exchange, you're actually building a relationship over time so that 5, 10, 20 years from now, even after you're gone, your business, your system, that reputation will still be there. That's why we have these major corporations, even smaller businesses that are named after their founders, and the reputation of their founders has not even preceded them. It's like surpassed them by, in some cases, dozens, not hundreds of years. But that reputation is still there. The reputation of the McDonald's brothers, the reputation of Chase Bay. So there's so many different things that come up that have to do with the quantitative qualitative relationship and not the quantitative relationship. You're just looking at the qualitative thing and trying to get the quick sale. If you're in it for the long haul, you can't do that. You have to build over time. You can't get sloppy. That means you have to think beyond just the next paycheck. Now, you have more time than you think to build those relationships. Seth Godin, who's an excellent marketing thought leader, I've worked with him at the Akimbo workshop. It's at akimbo.com. I was a student as part of his marketing seminar. Check it out. He talks about, which is one of my favorite sayings from him, he talks about not taking the shortcut, but the long cut. Not the shortcut, but the long cut. Because essentially, when you take a shortcut, as someone said recently, you're missing all the lessons that would actually come from that, right? As opposed to taking the long cut, where you're getting all the information, all the insight, you're learning, and all those lessons along the way, as you develop that patience, that will come in handy later. It's almost like, I liken it to being a mountain climber. And there's something called climatizing, where as you go up a mountain, you'll stop at a base camp. The reason why you stop at a base camp isn't necessarily because you're tired or you need food or someone got injured. You stop there so that your body can get used to the lesser oxygen available at that level. Because as you go higher up the mountain, particularly the taller mountains, the less oxygen that's available because most of the oxygen is here on the ground. So you have to stop at these base camps. Otherwise, if you keep pushing up the mountain and pushing yourself too far, then you're going to run out of breath. Some people even die, right? Because not enough oxygen gets to their brain. They haven't climatized. That's what Seth is talking about. If you actually do the route and do the work along the way, you build this beautiful foundation. The quantitative stuff, sure, you might be able to make $100,000 this year. You might be able to get 10,000 customers, as we did with my first startup, Cuddler, and we surpassed that. You might be able to get that relatively quickly. We got ours in our first, couple of days. We had 10,000 customers with my last startup, Cuddler. But you can focus on the quantitative, but the qualitative is, what is the customer experience? How many are coming back? Will they recommend it to someone else? That stuff you only get on the long cut. To be frank, the only reason why I have a career today is because I've taken the long cut with y'all. Whether it's my books, from The Ultimate Bite-Sized Entrepreneur to the new one, Built From Now, me coming to y'all at this point every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 11:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, but doing this for months. So right now, as of this recording, there's 125 episodes of this Bring Your Worst show. And there's so many different things that I've learned along the way, from getting the lighting proper, to how to conversate with y'all, to figuring out what you want me to talk about, to even learning how to speak to a camera when I'm usually on the road. And because we're in COVID times, I haven't been able to be on the road. But taking the shortcut, that would mean that the lighting would be sloppy. I wouldn't know how to communicate with y'all. I wouldn't even know what y'all needed. And there's a way that I wouldn't be able to support y'all that would be unfortunate. And y'all would recognize that. But instead, based on the feedback, you recognize that I'm here for you and I'm taking the long cut. I'm not going anywhere, just like I did with my other business ventures.
I love this story by Seth Godin. 3 types of people that you meet in the grocery line. The first person is always looking for the new angle. But while they're going for that new opportunity, that old opportunity, that line that they were waiting in is actually moving. So they go back to their old line and they end up getting frustrated. They feel like that they don't necessarily have the upper hand and that other people have better things than they do. The second person that will stay in the line no matter what. There could be a new opening, they won't move. Third person and waits and watch and observe. When they see a true opportunity, they're ready to move on it. They're the ones that get through the lines the fastest. So as you show up today, what kind of person are you being?
Today we're going to talk about the final 1%. Why we often will put our energy into something, go so hard into something, and then at the last second, things just fall apart. Have you experienced that? I know I certainly have. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, but a lot of it comes back to this simple parable that I believe I read in the 48 Laws of Power, but I read it like 15 years ago and I think about it all the time. There's a monk and there's a young monk. So older one who's more of a mentor and a young one who's just getting out of the proverbial academy. His last lesson, the young monk, is to climb a tree. Really tall tree. So the older monk comes out there and he's like, okay, go for it. And the young monk's eager. He starts climbing a tree. He's super fast. He climbs all the way up, gets to the top. It's like, all right, come down. And he comes down, and otherwise the older monk is silent. Comes all the way down. All the way down. It's a tall tree. This is his last lesson. And then when he's like 10 feet from the ground, a little bit taller than me perhaps, then the wise monk says, okay, be careful, watch your feet, slow down a little bit. And suddenly he's giving him all this advice. The young monk gets on the ground safely, and he's like, congratulations. And the young monk's like, all right, I went all the way up this 200-foot tree or whatever. Why didn't you say anything? You didn't say anything until I was almost going to hit the ground. I already did it. And he said, when you're almost complete, that's when you're most likely to make a mistake. Now, I mentioned this parable very briefly in The Ultimate Bite-Sized Entrepreneur. Thank you all for making it a bestseller a few years ago. So you can check out a little bit more about the final 1%. That's the name of the chapter. What I wanted to talk about in this show is more about why that final 1% ends up being so much of an issue. With the final 1%, that's when the pressure is the most, and when we're most likely, frankly, to get the most lazy, or at least the most complacent. Lazy sounds a little bit judgmental. I'll be a little bit easier on it. The most complacent. Because we think we got it already. Everything is fine. The problem with that, of course, is that it's not fine because you're not done. You're not at the finish line yet. So there are two ways to make sure that you can stay with this. The first thing is to always keep the end in mind. As Stephen Covey of First Things First. In fact, I have a video about how to prioritize your life. It talks about the rocks analogy. Check that out. I'll be sure to throw a link in here from Stephen Covey's book. What he talks about is to begin with end in mind and then work backwards from the end. Where do you want to end up? What's your main intention? As some of my spiritual mentors and friends would say, what's the feeling that you want to feel when you're at the finish line? What does that look like? Start with that. As Abraham Hicks would say, rest in peace to them. What is that feeling that you want to have? Hold that feeling and then work towards that. So essentially you're working backwards. There's goals that I have that are 2, 3, in some cases 5 years out, and I already know the feeling that I'm going to have as I reach that goal. But then here's the trick. Beyond the spiritual side or the feeling side, the more emotive, abstract side, once you capture that feeling, once you know where you want to end up, then everything else becomes easier because you're working backwards. For instance, if you want to publish a book in, say, 3 years, which is a good timeline, well, then you have to get it to the final version. Let's say a traditional publisher, you want to get the final version to the publisher. You need to do a book proposal. You need to have an agent who will actually work the book proposal and get in tip-top shape. Before that, you need a skeleton of the book proposal. Before that, you need to practice your writing and figure out exactly what you want to say. You have to get your general craft together and maybe start working with people who are writers, people who are agents. So once you do find an agent, or once you are to the point where you need an agent, it won't be as hard. You see how that works? And maybe that feeling is, I want to have a book available in the local bookstore. And that's the feeling you want to concentrate on for 3 years from now, right? It's 2021 right now. So in 2024, I'm going to have a book on the shelf that's available for my family to buy, and it will be at the local Barnes & Nobles. Work backwards from there. That allows you to not get sloppy in the final 1%, because if you don't have that feeling yet, you're not done. Just like the young monk, as he was getting more excited, coming down the tree, that final 1% is where he was most likely to fall down. Even if it was only 10 feet, he still wouldn't have accomplished what he would have accomplished. And wouldn't that be a shame to go up 200 feet, to come down 190, and then to fall apart? But we do that all the time. I think often it's because we don't focus on the feeling we want to have at the end. Instead, we're focused on whatever the next step is. That's when we start to get sloppy. The second part, shout out to Jen A. Miller, who did a book called Running a Love Story. She's a colleague of mine. I actually mentioned her a couple times. She's a marathon runner. And one of the things that I learned from reading her writing, as well as some of my relatives who have ran marathons, I come from a family of runners, is to always make sure you have enough energy to go beyond the finish line. Marathon runners, and I used to do more basic running, not marathons, people talk about a wall, right? You might have heard about that. You hit a certain wall. If you're a marathon runner, that wall, I believe, is around 23 miles of that 26-mile marathon. To finish a marathon, you have to get through the wall. The wall means that your body, or more importantly, your mind, knows that you're almost done. You push yourself for 23 miles. Think about that. I ran a mile or two. People push themselves for 23 miles. They know they have 3 more miles to go. Any other time, any other day, if you're a marathon runner, you're used to running miles at a time. But today, mentally, you know you have 26 miles. You're pushing yourself as hard as you can. The weather might be bad, whatever issues might happen on marathon day. And your mind's like, well, you got 3 more miles to go. We're gonna start shutting down. That's what they call the wall. Now you might experience that again, like I have, where you might run a mile or two, and at 75% of that mile, when you hit the 0.75 point of that mile, suddenly you start getting really tired and winded. That's your mind. So what you really want to do is go a little bit beyond. Expect that you're going to go beyond. There's so many people, and Jen and other people who've written about running have talked about this all the time. There's so many people who work their whole life. They work their life too. Work their whole life to have this experience. And then they end up falling apart in that last mile, that last proverbial 1%. But that's because they start mentally checking out and saying, oh, I'm almost done. I can slow down a little bit. That's not what you want to do. You want to know when you're complete, but you also want to have the energy to move forward. It's so important to know what your intention is, even before you start the journey. And number one, if you know what kind of feeling you want to have at the end, and then work backwards from there, that'll make sure you don't skip any steps. As Seth Godin would say, you don't take the shortcut, you take the long cut. You make sure everything is taken care of. Going back to the book analogy, imagine if you got a book deal tomorrow, but you haven't written a word before. How much pain and suffering, you tell a writer, how much pain and suffering would you go through because you don't know what you're doing? You didn't take the time. You didn't learn the craft. Maybe you didn't get a proper agent. There's a lot of sloppiness there, and it makes it so much harder to actually succeed. And so that final 1% might take forever. You might quit along the way because you haven't done the proper work. Second part, as Jen talks about, is that you want to have the energy to go beyond just the finish line. Because once you get to that final 1%, there's going to be a lot of mental things that are going to be happening. And if you make sure that you're thorough for that, not saying I'm going to stop there, I'm going to stop a little bit beyond that, then you're more likely to succeed. If you want to get more insight like this in regards to setting your goals, be sure and check out my playlist called Smart Creative Habits and Routines. It's like 12 episodes, short like this. It's insight from Simon Sinek, from Brene Brown. I think Beyonce might be on there, but all kinds of cultural influencers, thought leaders, and people who are insightful about how to do really strong goal setting and how to get the habits. It's not always about reaching a certain goal, but about creating the habits and the routines to allow you to reach those goals. You want to be consistent, not just aggressive. Until next time, remember to bring your worth and that you can always build from now. Take care.